So this morning I've been putting up some of my pumpkins that we grew in the garden this year. Most of the time what I use pumpkins for is I make pies and cakes and breads with them. In days gone by though, people use pumpkins a whole lot more than that. I might make a pumpkin soup every once in a while or something like that, but mostly I'm just using it for desserts or breads. That's pretty much it. But as I said, in the old days, it was a very versatile vegetable. And when you think about how large pumpkins get, it makes sense because, you know, they had bigger families, they needed more food. And pumpkins store very well too. So that was another thing that was great about growing pumpkins in days gone by, was that you could store them whole without worrying about canning them or drying them or freezing them, and they would last a long time throughout the winter, so then you could harvest as you needed. Harvest from where you were storing them and then cut them up is what I mean, so that you could use them to feed your family with. I'm going to read to you a little piece from John Parris, one of my favorite writers from Appalachia. Predominantly he focused on the western North Carolina mountains of Appalachia, but it's from his piece called "Pumpkin is More Than Just Pie," and this was at Laurel Branch. I won't read all of it to you, but this part's really interesting. So some mountain women, or let's see, I'm going to start right there. And some still make pumpkin molasses, which provided sweetening in Grandma's day. So pumpkin molasses. Back then, the word molasses was used in the same sense we use syrup today. So in my family growing up, when we talked about sorghum syrup, a lot of people do call it molasses, but we just called it syrup. It was just syrup. So that's what he's saying. They made, it's very interesting, made pumpkin molasses or pumpkin syrup. So when cooked for a long time in a large quantity of water, strained, and then water further reduced by boiling, you have pumpkin molasses. I would love to try that. Then there is pumpkin whiskey. As knowledgeable old-timers will tell you, pumpkin whiskey is a heap sight easier to make than corn whiskey and not as risky. All you need is sugar and a good-sized pumpkin. You cut a plug out of the top of the pumpkin, clean out the seeds and the pulpy mass to the meat. Then you pack the hollowed out pumpkin full of sugar, replace the plug, seal it with wax, and set the pumpkin under the bed or in a dark place. In a week or so, the sugar has turned to liquid and you've got yourself a quart or so of whiskey. Interesting. The pumpkin, truly a symbol of autumn, is deep-rooted in American life. In the early days, it was used stewed in soups and stews, in pie and pudding. The flesh was dried for winter and early spring. The seeds were used as a delicacy. The early settlers here in the hills learned to grow them in their fields of corn. It was common practice 50 years ago to plant a seed of pumpkin in a hill of corn. To the pioneers, the pumpkin was one of the most versatile of vegetables. Pumpkin could be stored in the fall down under the fodder bundles and then served as a vegetable. Peeled and boiled, it was then fried through most of the winter. It could be dried or freshly cooked and put into the cornbread batter. Most of us think of pumpkin pies when we see a wagon load of pumpkins, or pumpkins sitting on the back porch or lying at the door of a barn waiting to be stored down under the fodder. But pumpkin is more than just pie. It is a bread and a pudding, a butter and a molasses. And many a mountain family right now is savoring one or all of them. So John Parris wrote that a long time ago, but he's right about some mountain family savoring it right now, because my family is going to savor pumpkin this time of the year. We do, whether it's in pies or breads. But all those interesting ways he shared that in days gone by that they used pumpkin for. I don't know about the whiskey. That sounds really interesting, though, that you could just do that. Some of you can share if you've ever heard of pumpkin whiskey like that. I do want to try, he mentioned drying. This year, for the first time, I'm going to try drying some pumpkin. I've never done that before. Then you would just reconstitute it, either to use in pies or breads or whatever, or to stew. A lot of people stew pumpkin or bake it in the oven and mix it with sugar, like brown sugar and cream or something like that, and eat it as kind of a dessert side dish. And then frying pumpkin, like he said. I've never fried pumpkin, so I need to try that. But today I'm going to share, it's John Parris's recipe. He has, the first thing I read from come out of his book, These Storied Mountains. It actually, all of his articles, or all of his pieces were articles in the Asheville Citizen over the years, and then he compiled them into books. So the pumpkin article I read you come from These Storied Mountains, but it was originally published in the Asheville Citizen Times. And then the recipe for his pumpkin bread, actually he put together a book, a cookbook, Mountain Cooking by John Parris. It's a great cookbook. In the front of it, he has a lot of the little articles that he wrote over the years about food, and then in the back of it is a lot of the recipes. So today we're going to make John Parris's pumpkin bread. So I'm going to go over the ingredients, but I'll put them in the description below so you can check there for instead of trying to write them down as I say them. So you're going to need 2 cups of sugar, 4 eggs beaten, 2/3 cup water, 2 cups of pumpkin cooked, 1 cup of oil or melted shortening, he says, 3½ cups flour, 2 teaspoons of soda, sody as Granny and Pap would say, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon allspice, 1 teaspoon baking powder, 1 teaspoon cloves, 1 teaspoon cinnamon, 1 teaspoon nutmeg, and 1/2 cup of raisins and 1/4 cup of nuts, and that's just optional. I'm going to add them because we like raisins and nuts, but you could certainly leave them out. So the first step is we're going to combine the sugar and the eggs, the water, the pumpkin, and the oil or the shortening, whichever you're using. And then once it's combined, you sift together your flour, soda, salt, baking powder, and spices. And I've already done that this morning. I say we because Corey helped me. She helped me get everything ready. So I've already sifted those ingredients. And then you just mix it all together. So basically this is a really easy recipe and you don't have to drag the mixer out or anything like that. And then we're going to put it in a greased loaf pan, or I like to use parchment paper if you want to use parchment paper, and bake at 350 for about an hour. Now his recipes are really old, so I've found that you kind of have to just keep a really good eye on it in the beginning, the first time that you make the recipe, to see how long it takes in your recipe. So in your oven. So it may take longer or it may take not as long. It just depends. So now we're going to put it together. So we're going to start with combining our sugar, our beaten eggs, our water, and our oil. Now that I've got that kind of mixed up, I'm going to add in the pumpkin. So now that I've got that mixed in, we're going to add our flour and salt and soda mixture. Oh, and it smells so good. It really smells like fall of the year. The pumpkin and all the spices. When it starts baking, my whole house will smell like that, so that'll be great. I'm going to add in the nuts. I'm just using pecans, but you could use no nuts or whatever nuts you want, and the raisins. Stir those in. I think black walnuts would be especially good, but I'm using pecans today. Now we're going to pour it in the pan, baking pan. A lot of times in the past, when I find that when I make recipes like this, sometimes it seems like it's too much for one of my loaf pans, even though that's what the recipe has, what it says. So when that happens, I have some little loaf pans that I use sometimes, just pour the extra in there. But you can also just pour it in any kind of like a muffin tin or any kind of little pan that you have, and just bake it like that. And you'll just have multiple cakes or breads instead of just the one. But putting it in a smaller loaf pan or also in the a muffin pan is a really good way to use it. And see, that's what I was thinking, that's what this recipe was going to be. So that's what I'm going to end up doing with it. I was thinking that's an awful lot to go. It's been a long time since I made this recipe. So you can see it filled this up. So now I'm going to get one of my muffin tins out and make some muffins with the rest of it. So with that extra batter, I ended up having almost enough to completely fill my muffin pan. I like to do muffins like this because they're easy to take along with you if you go somewhere. They're easy for Matt to take to work so that he can eat them for lunch or for a snack along the way, for breakfast, those kind of things. So you might wonder, well, how do you know if you've got extra? Well, of course, I had so much with this recipe, the pan would have literally overflowed if I'd kept putting it in there. But I aim for, when I make bread in a bread pan, I'm aim for, whether it's like a cake type like this or bread, you want to be like within 3/4 of the, you don't want to go any higher than 3/4 of the way up. Now, you might be making a bread that really rises high, that might be even less, but for a bread like this, as long as you're about 3/4 of the way, you should be good. And the same for muffins. It just depends on your preference. If you like smaller muffins or if you like larger muffins, you might just have to play around with that. But this might have been enough to do 2 loaf pans. So if you're making this recipe and you want to try 2, you could just have, I could have not filled the one that I filled so full. You could put a little less and equal them out because it made a lot of muffins, so with that extra. And I've found that often to be true when I make bread recipes like this for loaf pans. It often makes more than what actually fits in your loaf pan. So now I'm going to put these in the oven, and then once they're done, I'll be sure to show you how it turns out. So the pumpkin bread is ready. Someone's already test drove the muffins that I made with the extra batter, and they say they're very good. So let's see how the bread turned out. Smells so much like fall. I wish you could smell it. I like the end pieces. Is that the piece you like, or you like the inside? Y'all have to tell me that. I like the end because it's got the crunchy outside on it. You can kind of see a little bit of pumpkin there that didn't cook up. If you don't like that, you can make sure to really put your pumpkin through the food processor or something like that and really chop it fine. That doesn't bother me though. Which side should I taste first? Very good. Tastes like fall of the year for sure. This bread is much, much sweeter than the apple bread I shared a week or so ago. So this is much more like a dessert bread. The apple bread's not that sweet, so you think of it more like maybe a breakfast bread or something like that that you could toast and eat. This is really sweet, so this is like a real dessert bread, but it's very good. Another way that we do use pumpkin that I forgot to mention when I was talking about the cakes and the breads and the pies is that we roast the seeds. I usually keep some seeds to plant the following year, maybe to share with others, that kind of thing. But then we roast them too, and they're really good. So if you've never had roasted pumpkin seeds, or you can do other kind of squash seeds like that too, like the cushaw, those kind of things. They're really good for a snack and really healthy, of course, so they're good. But I hope you enjoyed learning about how people used pumpkins in the old days here in Appalachia, in the mountains of North Carolina. And I hope you enjoyed seeing how to make John Parris's pumpkin bread. It's really good if you get a chance to make it. And as always, I hope you'll keep dropping back by and helping me celebrate Appalachia.